At this time, I want to invite my friend Mercy Anderson to come up. And we are in the middle of a series. We'll go ahead and take this. We're in the middle of a series about Jesus. And each week I've been trying to be intentional about thank you, Mercy. I've been trying to be intentional about having different people give a different representation of who Jesus is to them. Before Mercy jumps into her view, I want to give a quick recap. If you're first time, you might be like, what do you mean there's different views of Jesus? And what are you talking about? Jesus is Jesus. We started a series off with diving into 4 different views that are commonly held, more commonly than people think, especially within the Christian tradition. And it's everything from, I'm going to forget all the names right off the top of my head, but we have a more Savior Jesus, who Jesus is my Lord and Savior. Then we have Teacher Jesus, who could be your Savior, or he could just be a good teacher to follow. Then you have a mythic Jesus. Let me back up. You have Christ consciousness, which sounds real woo-woo, but it's not as woo-woo as it sounds. And let's be honest, I'm okay with the woo-woo. But if you're not, and you're like, what does that mean? Mercy might even chime in and give us a little bit of that. But it's more of understanding that this too resides in you, and it's a path for you to unlock for yourself. And then the last is mythic Jesus, which is reading Jesus like a good story that has, whether it was fact or fiction, isn't really the point for a mythic view. It's saying there's something deep within this that resonates, and I think we could all learn from. So I'm laying the ground on that so you know this is sort of where we're coming from when we talk about different views of Jesus. I was raised to only have one view, and I quickly learned that a lot of people in the world had different views, and I had no idea. So we're hearing about those different views and what those mean to each of us. And so I invited Mercy to share her perspective, and I said this to every single person, but feel free to share, and nothing's off the table, so say from the heart.
Even the woo-woo, I like it.
You can say the woo-woo, yes.
Hi, guys. If we haven't met, I'm Mercy. When Angie asked me to share who Jesus is to me, I was kind of like, at what point exactly? Because I feel like my idea of Jesus has just evolved through my whole life, but especially in the last few years. And I thought I'd just kind of tell a little story about who Jesus is to me. But I grew up with parents who were part-time missionaries, so deeply conservative, evangelical. As a small child, they trained me to evangelize and save souls. So at 7 years old, I was converting kids in the McDonald's play pit. I was just very gung-ho. And it was weird because it was such this like far-off theology. Like it was all about eternity and heaven and hell and damnation, and it didn't have much for here and now except for Jesus. And so I clung to that piece. I was really weird. I prayed a lot. I would talk to Jesus for hours and hours, and Jesus was my best friend. And when I grew up, I even did the whole Jesus is my boyfriend thing in high school. I just didn't want a boyfriend, so Jesus was a good beard. But it was just a very personal Jesus. It was like my Jesus who I talked to. And then as I got older, I kind of came into this deconstruction and was like, oh, crap, like I don't believe this. I don't know what's real. I didn't think Jesus was real. I didn't think the Bible was real. And I became lonely and depressed and suicidal. And it was like I had lost. It was like a best friend had died. Like I have lost something so important to me. And I kind of was like, okay, forget what's real, what's true. And so I started to look for like, where is truth in this tradition? And I started to really connect with woo-woo Jesus. And this idea of the whole point of Jesus was that he was both fully human and fully divine, that those were not separate. It wasn't, here is Jesus connecting us to God. It was, here is Jesus showing us that humanity and divinity are intertwined, that they can exist in one space. And not only that, but anywhere that our humanity finds holiness. So like those of you who are in Mexico and intimacy with people who love each other, or sunsets, or creativity, like that is Christ. That is holiness in tangible form that you can touch. And that changed everything for me, and I think it's why I came back to Christianity. And as I came back with my woo-woo Jesus, the physical person of Jesus started to kind of make its way back in. And I started to really be confronted with this guy, historically, probably walked on the earth, and he always went to the lowliest places of humanity and said, this is where God is. And he always came against the religious establishment, and he always called out cultural privilege. And he was a hardcore activist, literally killed for his activism. And that became the mythic Jesus of this hero's journey of enlightenment that we can take, and this way that we can live. And I feel like it's just been this, now when I think of Jesus, I find Jesus in all of these versions of Jesus that Angie's talk about. The ritual and the richness of creedal Jesus is dear to my heart, because that's what I grew up with. The enlightened Jesus that says, this is my path to find God in me and God in everyone else. The mythic Jesus that calls us to this journey, they're all there, and there's so much more spaciousness in that, I think, and a Jesus that isn't confined by one version of what we want to make him into. And if I could say one more thing, that just, I think one of the things that's most powerful for me in the Christian tradition is we're the only religion that killed our own God. And I think there's something so beautiful in this idea of taking the God you were given and killing it so that you can have resurrection and new life, so that you find a God, maybe in one of these versions of Jesus, that's actually alive and that is true and does things in your life, through you, with you, however you want to see that. So that's kind of the arc that I've been through. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mercy. Thank you. Sure, if you want to. Thank you, friend. There were so many random nuggets in there. Did anybody get some, like, oh my gosh, that was so good? I asked Mercy a couple times if she wanted to ever speak, and she was like, She said maybe, but right, so everybody just was like, oh, Bob, do you have a knack? Gosh, there's so much of my journey in her, my story in her story, and I'm planning on sharing that in 2 weeks, but I can understand that view of, I'll say this in a couple weeks, but for me, Jesus died. And not just like in the Bible, but for me, Jesus died and there was a resurrection. And I'll explain more in a couple weeks. So I'll leave that as a cliffhanger. Some of you are blinking like, what does she mean? I'll tell you later. So anyway, while we were in Mexico, there was about, 30-something of us in Mexico. Steve, my friend, up in the balcony, was holding down the fort. He's giving me the peace sign right now. Holding down the fort with, 30, 40 people, maybe, give or take, that were here. And so who was here not last week, because last week was Sabbath Saturday, the week before? Got a couple people. Yeah, you were here. So you joined in with the discussions that Steve led. I thought he did a fantastic job. I wasn't here, but I do this all the time. I go back and watch like every guest speaker. One, to make sure they didn't say anything crazy, which he did. And two, actually, it's just to see, like, I'm always the one talking, and it's really, really great for me to just be able to listen and hear somebody else's perspective. So I love going in and seeing, like, well, what if Steve has something to say that really speaks to my heart? Which, of course, I didn't doubt that he did. And so he really took an interesting turn, which I liked, which was talking about the hero's journey with a mythic Jesus. So if you've ever followed Joseph Campbell's work, he dove into that a little bit. If you haven't, Hero's Journey is a really fantastic story to dive into. Joseph Campbell, I think, shed some light on how all of these stories and narratives throughout history really call us as humans to see ourselves into it. And so he ended up focusing on the story of the woman caught in adultery. And I thought it was fascinating because he looked at this sort of in a mythic way, and then he opened it up. From what I saw, I wasn't present, but from what I saw on the video, it looked like he opened it up for group discussion on what this might mean for you. He went on to mention that most of us have read biblical texts in a mythic way, whether realizing it or not. And so we tend to think mythic as this huge thing, but most of us have read it that way, whether we realize it or not, because meaning we have a tendency to see ourselves in the story. Like, we do this with everything. You know what I'm talking about? Someone will tell you about their day. You can't help but instantly try to insert yourself in like, oh, I know what that feels like. I too have had that kind of a day. And that's what we naturally do with these stories, is we naturally go, we make it about those people then and there, but then we take it a step further and go, well, how does that relate to me and us right here and now? And this is a very mythic way of reading the text. And speaking about this story, he said this quote, which I think is pure gold, by the way, Steve. So we're going to quote it again tonight. He said, "The truth is in the story, regardless of who she was or whether she existed or not." So I'll say that again. He said the quote, "The truth is in the story, regardless of who she was or whether she existed or not." Now that is powerful, because a lot of times we can over-rationalize. If you were raised evangelical, and I'm speaking from that lens because I know that lens well with many of you. If you were raised evangelical, a lot of times you're taught to check your brain at the door. And it's all heart-centered, which is beautiful, but then it's very heart-heavy and not head-heavy at all. And then you end up going like a pendulum, and it swings the complete other way, where you're analytical. This is all, there's probably children in here, this is all BS. And so then you go, this isn't real, and heart shuts off, and you sever that, and you become all head-centered. And the balancing act is sort of trying to get back into coming to center, which I feel like I'm slowly doing as a human, is coming back to the center of, okay, what does this story mean to me? And other sacred texts, what do those mean for my life? Now, if you were raised the opposite, you probably were raised more thinking with your head, and it was very liturgical, and now you're wanting to maybe engage some of that heart. And so, again, it's learning to sort of see yourself in the story and what it means to you. We get so caught up in dogma and in details and facts and whether did this happen or not that we forget, as Steve is saying, the truth in the story. We forget it. We miss what's right in front of us, that the truth is in the story. It doesn't mean you have to like it. It doesn't mean that it even resonates sometimes. But often there's something here, some bigger mythic meaning-making thing. And I think that's what, as humans, we're all meaning-making creatures. I mean, that's, I think, why we're here tonight, right? We're hoping to have some sort of meaning. We're hoping to have some sort of connection. That's, I'm assuming, why most of us are here. And so we're meaning-making, storytelling creatures who like to connect. And that's what makes this beautiful. That's what makes our Mexico trips beautiful. If you haven't been, we'll probably have one maybe later in the year. And if not next year, it's fine. We will have another and more opportunities to connect. But that's what we're looking for, is connection and to walk alongside other people on this path of life. Because otherwise you feel really isolated and alone. And so we're going, how do we walk this life, this human life, and this spiritual life together? So in many ways, that's why we're exploring this question, who is Jesus? Because we all find some sort of different meaning in Jesus. And Jesus has meant something very differently to each and every one of us. Good, bad, but like I said, good, bad, ugly, and different, all of it. Jesus has meant something very different. I don't know if that's me. Do you hear that? It's me, you're saying. Yeah, I don't know where it's coming from, so we'll just go with it. But the thing is, the point of this Jesus story, and let me see if I can articulate this clearly. The story of Jesus doesn't matter if you can't see yourself in it. Does that make sense? And some people are going, no, Angie, that's heresy. Maybe. But I think if you can't in some way see yourself in this story, then what is this story doing for you? So in other words, if you can't see in some way or another your connection to Jesus or a relationship with Jesus or an inspiration of Jesus, in some way, if you can't, then it's like, what is this story to me? That makes sense why people like Mercy, why people like Michael Gungor eventually end up going, I'm learning different things. I can't see myself connected to this story anymore. This meaning-making isn't here anymore. And that's what happens to a lot of us. And so we find that there's other ways to understand this story, and that just so that everyone knows there's not a right way. And there can be pressure to feel like you need to conform and have one view over the other. And as humans, we're super biased. I will naturally tend to bond with someone that has my own view. That is very normal. but knowing that we all have something different here with this view. And so if we don't find, and why we ask who is Jesus, if we don't find meaning or healing in it, then why do we keep telling this story? Have you ever thought about that? Like, if Jesus means nothing, if we don't find anything, why on earth do we keep telling this story? And most of us have tried to get away from it, and we can't, and why? There's something deep and powerful here. So a few weeks ago, we went over a bit of the history of Jesus, and we discovered outside of biblical text, we went and kind of took a little bit of a history class, if you will, which we're going to try to do tonight, but hopefully I won't make you all fall asleep. We ended up looking at this history of Jesus, and we discovered that outside of biblical texts, there's not a lot about Jesus. There's not a lot of evidence, should we say, about Jesus. Now, there's enough historical documentation to know that he existed. We got that. That he was most likely lower class, that he was most likely a Jewish rabbi, and that he was executed for opposing the Roman Empire. Okay, so that's probably about all we know. We have a few different maybes, but there's not a lot of concrete evidence outside of Scripture. We just know of this man, this legend, this story that survived through the ages. So tonight we're going to combine that we discussed with a little bit more of a historical and mythical view as we look at Jesus of the four Gospels. And we'll explore the way that he's represented in each of the gospel. And then we'll spend a moment on a reflection. Does that sound good? Kind of walk it through it? Yep. If you start to fall asleep, neighbor, wake each other up. No, it's all good. We'll try to make this in a way that's relatable. To dive into the four different views, and I'm really going to spend mainly tonight only on the first three Gospels, because John is a wild card and completely different, which we'll discuss next week, okay? But it's important to have some really brief information on the New Testament Gospels. Now, each Gospel, and some of you might be biblical scholars in here, I know there's a few, and some of you may have never read the Bible. So I always talk to the person that has never read the Bible, because I'd rather everyone in the room understand. So if this is refresher, just nod your head and cruise along with me. So each gospel, sounds obvious, but each gospel is a separate account written by a different author, with a different lens to a different audience, and even to a different time period, okay? So we have four very different views, and you'll notice each one has a very different take on Jesus. Now, when I was younger, I didn't know, and I kind of just blended them all and meshed them all, which some scholars say you should, and some say no, you shouldn't. You should hold those as separate accounts. It's interesting when you start to look at them separately. You do see like you might see a few overlapping themes, but you see a different human in each story. Now, the other thing that you should know before we dive into Gospels is there's 40 years between the death of Jesus and the first written accounts of his life. 40 years. So I'm going to be 39 this summer. That's almost the entirety of my life. That would be like, just now am I starting to write about this thing? And that's mainly because that's not that uncommon at that time. A lot of things were passed down through an oral tradition. And so a lot of it was used with oral traditions of myths and storytelling, very common. So the first written accounts were written 40 years after he died. And so to put this in perspective, that's sort of like hearing about a legend named Martin Luther King Jr., and not reading, and passing down the story, but not actually reading about anything about him until 2008, which would be wild. That'd be really, really wild to go, wait, this guy actually died in 1968, and we're just now writing stories about him, and we're just now passing this information about. So there's a lot of time period that's passed here. Now, there's a lot of theories about where the Gospels came from, how they were written, and I so desperately want to dive deep into this, but this needs to be a whole other series on its own, because there's so much about how the canon was put together and who decided and what gave them the authority. That has always been an interesting topic to me, is who gave these people the authority to put these biblical texts together. Anyone with me on that? Everyone ever question, like, well, hey, who gave you the right of way to say this is God's word? Well, your pastor has wondered that. So you don't have to feel like a heretic. So there's theories about where they came from, but Matthew and Luke have many phrases that are almost direct quotes from the book of Mark. Most, if not all of the New Testament scholars believe there's what would be like a literary relationship between these books. That basically meaning Matthew and Luke copied directly from the book of Mark, which is fascinating. They literally copied large sections from the book of Mark. And because of this, most scholars accept what is called the Markan priority, which I think there might be a slide on that one. So the Markan priority basically is obvious. It just shows, hey, we have this original book here, and then these two people, because they're saying like large portions of the exact same thing Mark is saying, chances are they copied exactly word for word. If any of you are an English teacher, you know that how that works, or if you've ever taken an English class, you know how that works. When someone passes in an essay and you're like, wait a minute. This is word for word identical to what so-and-so said. You get an idea like what you cheated. Something happened here. So there's this thing where there's a lot of copying that happens. And then you'll notice the book of John isn't even on this, and we're not, like I said, not even going to touch that tonight, because the book of John is so different. It's so unique. It shares, it's over 90% unique content. It is like these three gospels over here are telling something about Jesus, and this one's way over talking about something else, which we will often call the cosmic Christ, the universal Christ. We'll go into that next week. There's a different characteristic to this Jesus in that book. However, recently many scholars believe in what's called like a two-source theory, that Matthew and Luke referred to the Gospel of Mark and another unknown lost book, which they're labeling Q. Has anyone ever heard of this, Q Gospel? Got a couple people. If you're interested, I think there's a slide, they're probably out of order, way at the bottom. I think there's a slide about a book called the Q, the Lost Gospel of Q. And if you're interested in reading more about it, this is a suggested book to read. It's the Lost Gospel of Q, the original sayings of Jesus. Now, the thing that's fascinating about this book is you'll read a little bit of the history, but then the rest is all of a collection of everything Jesus has ever said and put into, well, that we know, that we've seen and found in history, collected in this one book. So you could read it almost more like a devotional, if you want, or contemplative, almost like the sayings of Confucius. That's sort of how it is, like compiled. Here's everything that Jesus probably said. And so what they've gathered is there's some sort of lost gospel, this Q, and then Mark, and chances are the blend of these made Matthew and Luke. And so like I said, we'll jump into how does this relate to Jesus, but it's helpful to give you an idea of who and how these books came to be. The thing that's fascinating about that Q is the content. It's not new, but it's compiled all in one place. So you'll have like the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, Beatitudes. You'll have a lot of that all in one. But since the book of Mark was thought to be written first, let's start there. And we'll dive through. We'll kind of jump through each view, and you'll sort of get a different lens of Jesus through each book. And then at the end, we'll kind of have maybe a little bit of Q&A and reflection time, depending on the time for the evening, because I think we're running late tonight. So we'll start first. The book of Mark. Mark is the earliest gospel, and Mark, according to Mark would view Jesus as servant or legend. So that's kind of how we would get a brief overview, and we'll circle back. He would view Jesus as like a suffering servant and as a legend or a hero. It was written around 70 AD, which I realize for most of you, when it comes to timelines, you probably glaze over and you're like, I don't even know when that is. It's a long time ago. 70 AD, just to give you a glimpse of maybe what was happening in history, this was a really chaotic and violent time in Roman history. So you get a sense right away that things were really tense, really stressed. Mark's authorship is often attributed to the book of Mark. Obviously, it's named Mark. Yet its author remains anonymous. So we don't actually know, and you'll notice this a lot. So a quick note about authorship. Some of you may know this already. We'll notice this a lot, that a book will be named something but actually wasn't written by that person. And that's usually because it's assumed, like, hey, this has the writing style of this person. This person probably wrote it. Or because, hey, they said, this chances are might not be that person, but it's a follower of that person. Has a very, very similar flavor and flair. So for a great example would be the book of Isaiah, which actually might have been written by Isaiah's disciples after his death. But because it was in the same style of his teaching and his way of talking, they would have said, yeah, let's call it Isaiah, right? So kind of would make sense. If somebody kind of collected a lot of the things that I talked about, they would say, this is the book of Angie, which I don't even know what that would say. You are loved, probably. It would probably be really short. Or let's be honest, it's running late. It'd be really long. So let's skip through this because, like I said, we're cutting on time. So Mark, this is important to note. Mark was a Gentile, so he was not Jewish. And because of this, it was written to a Greco-Roman audience. Why this is important is because this is a vastly different audience than Jesus. This is a vastly different audience than probably the gospel was often presented. And so according to Mark, his view of Jesus is a bit of an enigma, we could say. It's a bit mysterious. Like you kind of know who Jesus is, but you kind of don't. He's a healer, a miracle worker. In many ways, it reads like a legend or a superhero because in this story, we have casting out demons. We have the story of Legion. We have healing the sick. We have walking on water. And so if you were to read all that, Jesus seems like an unstoppable superhero, right? That's like, who does that? How is this possible? So you get this view instantly of, whoa, this Jesus is doing all of this stuff and doing the unthinkable. And so Mark also depicts Jesus as a great teacher, but not just a teacher that talked all the time. Jesus was a teacher that acted. So we see this in Mark a lot, that Jesus did a lot of things. He made a lot of sacrifices, and he was diligent to do the work of serving others. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' divinity is kind of hidden, we could say. It's a little bit ambiguous. You get the sense there's something obviously special about this person because not every day people walk on water and do these things. You get an idea. There's something special about him, but you're not quite sure what. But I want to focus on something that is interesting when we talk about Jesus. Because this phrase gets mentioned a lot. Straight out the gate in Mark 1:1, the words written say, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So we could say, if we were reading this like a modern day fairy tale, it'd be, once upon a time, there was a man named Jesus, Messiah, the Son of God. Now, Son of God, we get hung up on this phrase often, and Son of God was something that I was told often growing up. But let's pause for a minute to talk about this phrase because I think this could help expand this phrase for some folks and maybe look at it from a different perspective. So we need to know, first of all, Son of God was a very common phrase for this time. We've taken it very literal as modern readers, very literal. We envision, and I'll throw this out there, and this is not meant to be an offense, but I'll throw this out there because some of you might be with me on this, that when we hear Son of God, we literally envision like a sky god impregnating a human woman, and then Jesus becomes the offspring. Anybody with me when we hear Son of God? You kind of envision, and I remember growing up thinking, I believed it and then didn't believe it all at the same time. I was like, how is this possible? First of all, I can't wrap my mind around, like, who is God? What is God? What does God look like? And then God all of a sudden gets a woman pregnant, and how? And then there's Jesus, and oh my gosh, I was so confused. And Son of God, knowing his audience, Mark uses a term really familiar with Greco-Romans. He uses a term they would have understood, which is Son of God. Now, Roman could call anyone noteworthy a son of God. Historically, there would have been many rulers, that would have been called the Son of God. So people that would have been called Son of God, Alexander the Great, the Emperor of Japan, a lot of Egyptian pharaohs were often called the Son of God, just in different languages. Jewish kings were called Son of God. Octavius, better known as Caesar Augustus, was also called the Son of God. And after Augustus's death, he was proclaimed what would have been called a Roman god. So Augustus was called the Son of God, then he dies, and now he's a risen God, which is super interesting to note. Anybody scratching your head like, what? I've never heard this in my entire life. You're okay. Okay. I'll have you know, let me pause and be transparent for a minute. I learned this a few years ago, and this was actually part of the thing that derailed my faith. I'm not going to lie. I started to learn a lot of historical things that made me go, what do I do with this? So I want to create some safety in this room, knowing that your views may feel threatened or challenged. That is not the goal. But I do understand, and I'm sensitive to that for me, that's what it did. It was sort of like someone took the rug and went, whoop, there you go. And I felt super shaky after learning some of this. So our modern worldview tends to think of a divinity as pertaining to only one God, very monotheistic. And we tend to be that way as a culture. But back in ancient times, there would have been many divinities, many deities. And many of them were human-like, demigods, if anybody's familiar with Greek mythology. I loved Greek mythology growing up, and now it's coming in handy. But this demigod, half human, half God. We hear that about Jesus all the time, right? Both God and man. And so it was it wasn't abnormal at the time at all to hear this belief of this demigod, this half God, half man. Son of also is important to note means nature of, or we could say essence of. So human containing the essence of the divine. Now, Son of God used in this text, in Mark's text, we should probably acknowledge that on one hand, there was probably some demigod-like quality to Jesus, and maybe that's what Mark is referring to. And then on the other hand, it was probably also very political. Because how could a poor Jewish man who stood against oppression hold the same title as Caesar Augustus? Do you get what's happening here? It's like, wait a minute, Caesar Augustus is this awesome demigod, godlike qualities actually inspired, came from God. So is Jesus, the low, the poor. How does this work? So one thing interesting to note is that Mark, which is the oldest and first account of Jesus' life, it does, and I don't want you to miss this, it does not have a birth or resurrection narrative. So this oldest account about Jesus doesn't have anything about how he got here, and it doesn't have any details about how he left. Some of you might be saying, like, well, wait a minute, at the very, very end of Mark, there's this story of Mary Magdalene and then Jesus revealing himself to the disciples. And yes, there is at the very, very end of the book of Mark. The thing that's fascinating is that's not included in the original manuscripts of Mark. That's added almost 200 years later. We see this often in biblical text where you're like, when was that added and why was that added? And a lot of times it was added because it was incongruent and they wanted to make it a little bit more orthodox. I'm not going to say one way or the other how or why, but that is what we know as fact, that the original Markian document wouldn't have included that Jesus appeared. It was Jesus ended, cut, stage left, next book. That's how it ended. Kind of leaves you like a cliffhanger. And then what? Well, that's sad. And actually, if you were to read Jesus from the book of Mark, you would almost read Jesus as this hero in this legend, but a failed hero and legend, because he doesn't resurrect. He doesn't do any of those things. It just stops, which is really fascinating. So to Mark, Jesus was the suffering servant, a miracle worker, and a son of God. Now let's skip to Matthew. Now I went long on Mark because we needed to touch base on a few key terms that Mark lays out, which we then find in the other Gospels. The others we'll cruise through. So Matthew looks at Jesus as a teacher, mainly a Jewish rabbi. And it's written around 90 AD, so we're talking years later after the book of Mark. And the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, possibly Aramaic, and written to a Jewish audience. Okay, so a completely different audience than Mark is writing to. And according to Matthew, this Jesus is really, honestly, more faithful to the law of Moses, to the Torah, than Moses himself. And so you kind of have him saying, than Moses and the Pharisees, you have him sort of positioning Jesus as this really devout Jewish follower. And in Matthew chapter 5, you see evidence of that in statements like Jesus makes, and you might have heard these, like, you have heard it said, but I say. He makes a lot of those statements in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard it said, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he expands on it. So you get this idea that he's reverting always back to law, honoring it. He's not dismantling it. He's honoring it, but then he's saying, okay, but let's actually even do it and do better. Like, this is what it says, but let's actually do it, and I think we could do it this way. So Matthew portrays Jesus as a Jewish rabbi, and in many ways, like this moral example of Judaism, you could say. He's a teacher who deeply means what he said, and in this one, unlike Mark, is doing a lot more talking than doing. So Mark, we have a lot of action in this, that, and the other, and if it was a movie, it would be like, and you're healed, and this, and that, and that, and that. And then Matthew's more like, and a lot of talking in this one, a lot of instruction. Now, Jesus never equates himself to God the Father in Matthew, yet you see hints of maybe a Trinitarian way of thinking. He'll mention Father, Son, Spirit. While not claiming to be the Son of God, he is characterized as the Messiah or the Anointed One. And we'll dive into Messiah next week when we look at universal Christ, because Messiah and Christ are the same thing. This gospel has been read as anti-Semitic. I can never say this word. Thank you, Semitic. Why is that hard? I want to add an extra syllable that's not there. Semitic. That was not challenging. It's read as anti-Semitic almost always. And that's because in Matthew's gospel, he makes the Jewish leaders the fault for Jesus' death. And if we read it as just that, that would be fine, but unfortunately a lot of theology, a lot of books, a lot of film, The Passion of the Christ, if you've ever seen it, a lot of it take that thought and that ball and they run with it. And so they in many, many ways villainize the Jewish leaders, portraying what I think is a very anti-Jewish gospel, which is really the opposite of his roots. He was very, very Jewish. So unlike the book of Mark, we see that in this book we find a birth narrative of Jesus. So in Mark we don't, and in Matthew we start to see a birth narrative. And it's similar in vibe to the birth stories of Moses and Joseph, has a very similar vibe, that life at that time is full of oppression, it's full of killing and lots of fleeing. There's lots of violence, these things happening, and there's a leader that rises up. Now to Matthew, Jesus was a great teacher who showed us how to bring the kingdom of God here and now. Now let's get to Luke, because Luke is the last one. Now Luke sees Jesus as a liberator, and if you've ever read a lot of, my goodness, there's a lot of books that I think would focus on this view of Jesus, especially if you're into maybe more progressive Christianity. A lot of them probably would focus on this view of liberator Jesus. Luke is also written around 90 AD, and this gospel was written to a Greek audience. So in Luke, we find another birth narrative. Yet, if you've ever compared and contrasted, they're very different. There's some similarities, but then like where he's at and who's with him and who follows him, all these things start to change. There's little variances in this detail. And the way Luke shapes his birth story, and I want you to pay attention to this part, is the way Luke shapes his birth story is how ancients would have told emperor birth stories. So it's similar to how we would have talked about the birth, again, of Caesar Augustus. You have this parallel, again, this comparing and contrasting in the Gospels, where you have Jesus over here and often against religious and political regimes. You have this like, here's this, here's this. You have this a lot. The only part of Luke that would not be found in the birth narrative of Augustus is Mary's song called the Magnificat. Steve went over that, I think, around Christmas time, and it was beautiful, such a beautiful thing to read. But this is similar to another song that we read in the book of Samuel. And the theme in both of these songs, why it even matters that I'm bringing it up, is the theme in both of these songs is that God overturns the top and the bottom, that the kingdom of heaven is upside down, which we sang about earlier, and that God raises up the poor and tears down the rich. So you kind of get this flip-flop world in Luke, where like all of these kingdoms, these rulers, the rich, those in power are being flip-flopped. And the poor, the oppressed, those that are needy, those people are actually getting justice. Those people are actually cared for. And so this is sort of Luke's view of Jesus, how he sees things in a very kingdom now and a heaven upside down, that everything is, that you know it is different. Now, stylistically, the Gospel of Luke follows step by step how historical accounts were written at this time. And so we could say it's sort of essentially like a biography of a revolutionary emperor, a new king who is going to overturn the structures of society. So when we talk about emperor and kingdom and politics and empire and all these things, I know a lot of people want to make religion, especially Jesus, very neutral. But I once heard it said, if you don't want to talk about politics or religion, don't invite Jesus to dinner. And it's really true. It's very, very true. I think we've tried to neutralize a message that's actually very, very, very potent and very political. And I think that could be for those people at that time, but then you read some things in Luke and you go, oh, those are for these people at this time. Like there's some similarities here in the way things are with oppression and rulers. So in Luke, the other interesting thing to note is Jesus' death isn't an atonement of sins. Instead, it's represented as a death of a prophet who followed God. In Luke, there's a scene where Jesus is praying in a garden and he's like sweating blood and an angel comforts him. And often these two verses that are mentioned about this praying and this sweating of the blood is often used as an atonement. I've heard this a lot of times. It's used as like a symbolism for atonement theory. Yet most scholars believe that these verses, again, weren't originally written in Luke. So these scriptures that talk about this, hinting to maybe an atonement, weren't originally written in the book of Luke, but were later added by Christian scribes because they didn't think the book of Luke was orthodox enough. How's that make y'all feel? Great? Now in hearing this, I want to pause because I feel like I just went on so much information. Pause for a quick second. How does that make you all feel knowing like there's some things you've learned, but maybe you're like, that doesn't sound like what I learned? Or maybe a book that you held really trustworthy and now you're going, I don't know, because people added stuff to that. How does that feel to hear those things? You can shout out a word, a phrase. This makes more sense? Okay. So this seems maybe more realistic. Okay. So it's frustrating. So for those maybe watching, it's frustrating that these things have been handed to us like, here, you'll buy this, you'll believe this. Sure? Okay. So I'll repeat that again for live stream and for those maybe in the back that couldn't hear. Sort of this idea of maybe it points to that man has continually been adding things to these books when maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was as simple as listening to Jesus' words, following that message of love and inclusion. Which is why a lot of people would call themselves red letter Christians, or some would read the Q source as they say, listen, I don't even know what end is up. I'm going to kind of just focus on these words. Which, if you're someone that's really got a lot of baggage with the Bible, something like the Q source is probably really helpful. It kind of gets you into reading some of these words without having to have the rest of that attached. And then if you get to a place where you can see maybe the Bible a little bit objectively, then you can pick it back up and it becomes sort of, well, for me, interesting. But I've always been a bit of a history nerd, so to me, biblical text is interesting. Not in the same way it was interesting when I was a kid, which was like, Matt, you have this problem in your life? Let me look up this is your answer. That would have been the way. Or like you need, yep, it says right here. I would have looked at it as an answer book, which in some ways it is, but in some ways, like, it's not. You know, when you hear modern people talk about modern day problems and then try to shove it in scripture, especially when you hear arguments about transgender. Well, the Bible says, actually, the Bible doesn't talk, let's just be real. The Bible doesn't talk about people being transgender. The Bible doesn't talk about Wi-Fi, the internet, TV. Like, let's just let it be what it is. So, any other thoughts before I continue with that? So we're adding things for certainty's sake, to make it make sense. And in some ways, I think you're right. I think it's probably adding it for certainty, adding it for control, adding it for who knows why, and there could be legit reasons why. I heard I'll butcher it, but a quote that says something like, if you ask someone to share their story, listen and don't try to change it. And it's so hard. When we invite someone in and say, well, tell me your story, tell me your perspective, we often want to tweak it and make it fit what we want. And it's interesting to look at the Bible sort of, it's hard because we all have a bias, right? We talked about this a few weeks ago. We all have a bias. It's just the way it is. Our skin color, where we're raised, what church we've been raised in. But it's interesting if you can sort of try to look at it as very unobjective and say, what is this saying? I'll invite it to tell a story, and I'm going to try not to change it. So that's interesting. So Luke would also call Jesus, he hints to the Son of God, but he says Son of the Most High. And he's still referring, as he's talking to the Greeks, he's still referring to language that they would understand, that they believed in these demigods, that basically descended from Mount Olympus, if you're familiar with this in Greek theology, it's almost like that, mythology. They descended from this Mount Olympus, and they came to live on earth, and they were half God, half human. So he would have used this terminology they would have been familiar with and comfortable with. Again, to us, that sounds really far-fetched for some of us. Not at all. That was the part of their mythic stories. So to summarize Luke, to Luke, Jesus was like this compassionate liberator, bringing and turning the kingdom upside down. It was always about bringing the kingdom here and now and turning things upside down as justice, liberation for the here and for the now. So at this point, we see that Mark's view is legend, Matthew's view is teacher, and Luke's view is like a liberator. Of those three, who is Jesus to you? Anybody want to, and you don't have to share, because at some point I want this to be reflective. But if you want, who is Jesus to you? Teacher, liberator, or legend? It's scary to say your view of Jesus, isn't it? How many of you have one that's none of those? Got a few people going, wait, Jesus isn't a legend or a liberator or teacher to me. Jesus is something else, okay? How many of you don't have a view of Jesus? Sort of like, meh, kind of indifferent. Yeah, God, I love people that are honest in this group. That's one thing I hope that if you're the new people will sense. There is a level here of, the reason why we're here was probably a myriad of reasons, but I think most of us have done church so long, we want honesty. And honesty means being able to be like, I don't actually care about this. Would you talk about something else, like vulnerability? Could you be Brene Brown, Angie? Which I love that too. Love it. So there's some of you like, yep, don't care. And then there's some of you that deeply do, and you're wrestling with this. So as the musicians come up at this time, we are a little over time tonight, my apologies. I want to invite you into a space of just allowing yourself to think for a minute and reflect and check in, sort of take an inventory. And if you want, you can go ahead and close your eyes. If you don't, and you want to just gaze down at your feet or maybe straight ahead at something, what I want you to do is tune into something that would allow you to tune into yourself. So maybe sort of taking a moment, not focusing on the conversations around you, not focusing on anything else other than yourself. So earlier I mentioned that if we don't see ourselves in the story, what's the point? And so as you're in this moment, I want to ask you, do you see yourself in this ancient story? A story over 2,000 years old, do you see yourself a part of this story? when thinking of Jesus, who is Jesus to you? A savior in time of need, a friend when you didn't have any friends, family when you didn't have family. Someone rescuing you, maybe even saving you from the afterlife. Someone who saved you from this life. Maybe Jesus used to be that for you, but is no longer that for you. And who is Jesus to you? Someone to learn from, someone to follow. Someone who's blazing the trail ahead of you so you can walk in his footsteps. Maybe Jesus is a deeper meaning of the meaning of life. Maybe you see yourself in Jesus. Something we're not often taught. Maybe you go, I know what death and resurrection feels like. I know what it feels like to have my trusted friends betray me. Maybe you see yourself in this story from that perspective. Now, in the different views, the view of liberator, are you the one who needs liberating, or are you the liberator? The Matthew view of teacher, are you the one who's teaching, or are you the one who needs the teaching? In Mark's view of the healer, are you the one desperate in need of healing, or are you the healer? Many of you may come to find the answer may be both. Many of you find you are and need both. As we conclude a portion of discovering the historical perspective of Jesus, we pause to reflect. Not who is Jesus, but how is Jesus inviting me into this story? We can say, what does this story mean to me? And take note of these feelings. If you feel like you were heard and this makes sense and this really brought light into doubts and questions you had, or if this actually brings about discomfort and confusion, take note of that. If this upholds something or tears down something, pause to reflect. And whoever Jesus is to you, fact, fiction, man, God, may we do the hard work of asking why this story matters. May we do the hard work of asking, how can we bring the kingdom here and now? May we do the hard work of asking, how can I be a liberator, a teacher, and a healer to many? Jesus, I don't often pray to you because I'll be honest, my view of you has expanded into something that I can't name. But in this place, we are reverent of you. We are in awe of you and where we've come from and what you've meant and do mean to so many of us. Be a guide to us. Be the light to us. And Spirit, the name I just can't name, I am grateful that I see you reflected and found in so many things. And may that grow and continue to grow in our world, in our country, in our politics, in our religion, in our human suffering, in our healing, in our joy, and in our pain. May we come to know that we are one as you are one. We ask these in your name. Amen.
On the vapor of it all, to chasing on the wind, the substance of the storm, so pale, thin. We set our hearts on you again. Heaven taunts the heart of man. We can feel it from within, the beauty of it all, the mystery, the swelling of a voice, a rising sea. Oh, behold the holy. Trees clap their hands for you, oceans they dance for you. You are holy. Oh, behold the holy. Billion suns rise for you, clouds paint the skies for you, and mountains stand tall for you, and valleys bow down to you. Everything rises to you, sing all our songs to you. Kings become fools for you, kingdoms to ruins for you. Vapor finds ground in you, music finds sound in you. Everything arising, 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 everything arises, everything arising, everything arising. You are holy.
One church, may you come to know the truth, whatever the truth is revealed to you. May you come to know this story in a way that makes sense for you, in a way that isn't twisted, formed, contorted to be anything other than it is. May you come to know the sacredness that's all around you. May you come to know the sacredness of yourself. May you learn that within this mirror that we have of Jesus being both human and divine, so are you. And may you know that at your core. May you have a wonderful Saturday evening. Maybe have a beautiful Sunday tomorrow. And whatever you do, may it be full of love, grace, kindness for our neighbor and for each other. Have a beautiful weekend. I'll see you next week.